With that kind of technology, of course, and of course with their very fast horses and their very powerful crossbows, the Tatars were virtually unstoppable. And before the Tatars got to Kiev, they were preceded by a whole number of peoples, one of them called, in English we call them the Polovichians, in Russian the Polovtsi, the Polovyetskia. These were very, very powerful people with whom, of course, many of the princes of the various city-states were forced to make alliances, and Igor, who came from a city named Putivl, made an alliance with a well-known Khan. The people who ruled with those people, with the invaders, were called Khans. You know that word, of course, through Genghis Khan. His real name is Chengiz Khan. These Polovichians were the predecessors of the Tatars. Igor had an alliance with Konchak, who was the Khan of the Polovichians, and as a matter of fact, he agreed for his son to make a dynastic alliance by marrying the daughter of the Khan. At one point in the 1100s, somewhere in the 1180s, Igor decided that he would, instead of making the dynastic alliance, attack the Polovichians. And the poem describes how he left the city. Unfortunately, as he went out of the city, there was a rather bad omen. An eclipse of the sun took place, and suddenly the people found themselves cast in darkness. You can imagine the fears of the people as they went out in their armor from the walls of the city, suddenly enveloped in darkness, and they heard the wolf cry, the cry of the birds, the howling of the wolves. This is something that frightened them very strongly, but Igor said, no, we will not let our fears stand in our way. Remember that they had both the pre-Christian religion at that time and the Christian religion. We will pray to God through Christ, and we will come through, and he went on. Well, he went out to meet the Polovichians, and in the beginning was rather successful. The first day went in favor of the Russians, but this being a Russian tale, alas, of course it always ends up that the Russians lose. This was, alas, a habit that the Russians had through many centuries of history. Almost his entire force was wiped out. With just a few men, was put into captivity. And of course, this was a very, very sad thing for Igor. Some of you might know the famous opera that was written in the 19th century by Borodin, composed on the topic of the tale of Prince Igor. And in the opera, you get some very powerful music. First of all, of Prince Igor lamenting his captivity, lamenting the fact that he's lost his army, he's done everything wrong, he's responsible for the murder of all of his fellow people, he hasn't protected the Russian territory like he's supposed to. They say Russian, of course, it wasn't Russia in those days, it was Rus. But the thing that consoles him is he thinks of his wife, of Yaroslavna, who becomes a very important figure in this tale. Then that's kind of cut off, and you see the fantastic dancing, the fantastic rhythms of the Tatars, who the parade of captive women are put before Igor. Konchak, who wants Igor to continue as his ally, says, look, we don't have to be enemies. Look, I'm treating you very well. Aren't you living in a good silk tent? Haven't I given you the best falcon for hunting? Haven't I given you my best horse? Haven't I given you my best bow? Is there anything you can complain about? Igor said, no, you indeed have treated me very well, but I have to remain faithful both to my wife and to the Russian land. And then, of course, the Khan spreads before him all the captive women, these beautiful captive women dressed, at least if you believe the Russian opera, in very, very sexually attractive dress, to tempt Igor. Igor is absolutely not to be tempted. His son, of course, is a somewhat different story, but Igor is not to be tempted. He stays faithful to his Yaroslavna. And so, luckily for Igor, he manages his escape. One of the most touching parts of this tale, and a form of literature that's going to go forward for many, many hundreds of years, is the figure of Yaroslavna. The presentation of the female, the presentation of the woman who was both beautiful and intelligent, and by the way, literate. It was quite unusual in those days for princesses to be literate, but these princesses were literate. She laments the loss of her husband. She complains to the god of the sun. Why did you shine, O sun? Dashboch was his name. Why did you shine, O sun, and get in the eyes of my beloved so they couldn't shoot straight? And then she talks to the god of the wind. Why did you blow from the Don River and blow Stribok? Why did you blow from the river Dnieper and blow the arrows not at the enemy but rather back? Why, oh why, nature, did you work against my beloved husband, against his beloved army, against the people from all of our places? And she says, I will take my beaver fur sleeve and I will dip it in the waters of the Don to wipe away the wounds of my beloved. And of course that beautiful beaver sleeve dipped in the waters of the Don, wiping away the blood of our beloved, is something that is very attractive and very powerful to the human imagination. Furthermore, at the very beginning of the poem, the epic is introduced with the character of Boyan, the famous seer, the famous bard of the time. Boyan, in the words of the manuscript, well, what we now have as a manuscript, sets forth 10 falcons upon a flock of swans. The first swan touched was the first to sing a song. Of course, these 10 falcons are actually his 10 fingers. He laid his magic fingers upon the living strings of the gusli, the lyre that he had in his hand. And through the magic of his fingers and the magic of the lyre, he brings forth a kind of poetry that holds people entranced, as the one who is reciting the poetry goes on and recites it in a certain sense for the first time. That is, he's composing it as he recites it. This is a wonderful, wonderful picture of the epic, a wonderful picture of how this epic poem reacted on the imaginations of the people in Kiev at that time. Later on, there's been some controversy over this epic. There have been some modern scholars who claim that it's not actually written at that time, but rather a fake which was done in the 18th century to try to bolster the Russian claims to the territory that's described, the Russian political claims to the territory that was described at that time. The controversy over this has been rather strong. As a matter of fact, I like to say more blood has been spilled over this controversy than was probably spilled in the battlefield of Prince Igor. And a very famous scholar in modern times, a man named Roman Jakobson, has published a great deal of material to try to prove that this was indeed a real, genuine manuscript at that time. And by now, I think of course, I used the wrong word there. It wasn't a manuscript at the time, it was a poem at that time, later put down in the manuscript. But using forms of language and history of language, he goes on to prove that it is genuine. It is not an 18th century fake. And as a matter of fact, because the man who was opposing him was a French scholar, he saw to it that all his materials were published in French, so the man would have no excuse not to read it. So that's rather well established at the present time that this epic is genuine and does go back to the 12th century. Of course, what it describes is a time that was a terrible one for Russia, a terrible one that saw the total destruction of Kiev. When the successors of the Polovichians, the Tatars, came through, they destroyed almost the entire substructure, the entire economic structure of Kiev as it existed at that time. Of course, what the Tatars wanted, in a certain sense, I like to call them the Americans of their day, they didn't care about religion, they cared about money. As long as you paid the money, they let you alone. And of course, consequently, they didn't stop the Christian religion. But if you did not give them money, or you gave them less money than they demanded, they simply murdered the whole city. It was a time of terrible slaughter, and of course a time for over 200 years that this territory was ruled entirely by the Tatars, by the Khans who ruled the Tatars, in the city of Kazan, about 400 or 500 miles to the east of what's now Moscow. What happened, of course, was that Kiev went into a kind of a fall. Kiev no longer became the political or economic center of East Slavic culture, and a new city grew up, somewhat to the northeast of Kiev, approximately 300 to 400 miles. There was a river that sort of meandered around the countryside with no particular direction. It was hard to find which way it flowed, and of course, as it flowed, it made rather large curves in its flow. This river is called Moskva, M-O-S-K-V-A. Of course, in English we say Moscow. The East Slavs who settled in that particular territory saw that they could use the river's turn to an advantage. They could build a fortress in the turn of the river and then dig a canal on the other side so the fortress, if necessary, could be surrounded by water. The Russian word for fortress in those days, and still is, Kreml. So, of course, this was the beginning of the Moscow Kreml, which you know as the Moscow Kremlin. The word Kremlin, of course, comes to us through Polish. They established this fortress so powerfully that they really held off the enemy forces who wanted to attack. Furthermore, Moscow is formed in a kind of a hollow surrounded by hills, by shallow hills. They placed sentries on the hills, and when the sentries would see the Tatars approaching, they would give smoke signals, which would be the signal to flood the canal and surround the fortress with water. This worked so beautifully that the Tatars only burned down the Kremlin twice, which gives you some idea of the relative power of the Tatars and the East Slavs. However, by the 1500s, the settlers of Moscow, and of course it was Moscow that then became the center of the East Slavic territory, and by this time one can begin to talk about the Russian language. These were people who were speaking the Russian language, which by this time, of course, was quite far from that Church Slavic I was talking about before. A prince came to the throne in Moscow by the name of Ivan. In Russian, he was called Ivan Grozny. That's to say, Ivan, the predecessor of thunderstorms, the man who gives thunderstorms. We call him Ivan the Terrible. You might ask why he was considered so terrible. Well, he was not the gentlest man in the world. He started a bunch of police called the Oprichnina, who went around murdering the people that Ivan didn't like. On their saddles, they used to have a skull and a broom. The skull, of course, you can imagine what that stood for. The broom was they were going to sweep everything clear of people around them. Not only did the general people in Moscow suffer from the cruelty of Ivan, but he used to carry around a very sharp stick. A stick which he walked on had a very sharp edge, and one day he was evidently annoyed with his son. Now I admit, as a father who's raised some children, children can be somewhat annoying at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, particularly if it's rainy outside. You've had them all day, but as angry as you might get, I think you would agree with me, you're not supposed to kill them. You may get angry at them. You're not supposed to kill them. Ivan, however, took this sharp stick and simply punched right through his son's body. The son died in his lap while Ivan lamented the death of his own son. You get the idea that he was not the most normal sort of a person whom you would like to have as your roommate in college or something of the sort. Ivan was a tremendously cruel person, a tremendously aggressive person, but also a very powerful Tsar who brought the whole domain of Muscovy, as it was called in those days, together. Furthermore, he demanded that he be called emperor by people who wanted to deal with him. And of course, the word for emperor in those days was Caesar, from the great Caesar of Roman times. And the Russian form of Caesar is Caesar. Consequently, he became the first Tsar of the Russias. That's how that term came to be. And he decided at one point that his army was powerful enough to march to the east and to conquer the city and the fortress at Kazan, where the Tatars had been ruling the territory. So he put the army in the hands of his faithful general, a man named Kurbsky, also quite a brilliant man. The army marched to the east and managed to explode gunpowder underneath the fortress of the Tatars in such a way that it broke the power of the Tatars. So from the middle of the 1500s onward, Moscow was going to be the center of power at that particular territory. Later on, Ivan got sort of suspicious of Kurbsky because he thought, look, a man who had this kind of talent and power might be a threat to him, so he decided to kill him. Well, when Kurbsky got the idea that Ivan wanted to kill him, he fled. He fled to Poland, where he went to the sides of the Roman Catholic Poles who were opposed to the Russians at that time. Ivan sent him a letter, said, you ran away, you're a traitor. He said, yeah, I ran away, all right. I ran away because you wanted to kill me. To which Ivan replied, and by the way, this correspondence has been preserved, has been translated in English. He said, look, I am God's representative on earth. If I wanted to kill you, that meant that God wanted you to be dead. You should have stayed here and be killed. Well, Kurbsky didn't quite see it that way. But the correspondence between Ivan and Kurbsky shows some of the genius as well as some of the madness, not only of Ivan, but also of Kurbsky, a tremendously interesting correspondence. Of course, Moscow went on. It was the political center of power at that time. Ivan was succeeded by a man named Boris Godunov, about whom we'll be talking a bit later. In English, you probably know him as Boris Godunov. Because of the fact that Ivan did not produce a successor, his son died. As a matter of fact, Boris's enemies accused him of killing the son. Because of this, Russia emerged into a time of troubles where the Polish armies came in, and there was actually a Polish Tsar who sat on the throne of Moscow. He went back to Poland rather fast. His head was shot out of a cannon in the direction of Poland. As you can see, it was not entirely without risk to become the Tsar in Moscow at that time. In short, the history was a very bloody one, And of course, in our next lecture, we'll be talking about how that history went forward and produced a culture in the 18th and the 19th century which produced the so-called golden age of Russian literature, an age in which we will find, I think, a tremendous amount of pleasure.